I sold the house where I had spent the best years of my life with my husband, just to give my son the wedding of his dreams. I thought I would be there beside him, as a mother, as part of the family. But in reality, they pushed me aside. They turned me into a shadow. At the wedding dinner, I heard words that felt like something inside my chest had snapped. And then, my own son's laughter, as if to confirm that I was no longer anyone. I stayed silent, smiled, and then I made one phone call that triggered a chain of events that turned everything upside down. You have no idea what I found in an old archive a few weeks later, or who my son turned out to be. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. I had spent the past 18 months pouring every ounce of myself into planning that wedding. After my husband died of a stroke, I sold the house we built together and used the money to give Joshua the day of his dreams. Or rather, the day he and Lauren had been dreaming of since high school. I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for help. I just wrote the checks, one after another, believing that love looked like sacrifice, that motherhood meant giving without asking to be seen. The ceremony was set at a luxury ranch in the foothills of the Rockies, rolling meadows, string lights, white chairs in perfect rows. There was a horse-drawn carriage, a harpist flown in from Boulder, a cake that looked like it belonged in a bridal magazine. Lauren wore a custom gown that cost more than I ever spent on a car. Every detail had been curated, elevated, made to look effortless. I stood behind it all like a quiet architect, invisible in plain sight. That morning, I spent hours getting ready. I wore the dusty rose chiffon dress I'd bought months before. I had my hair done in town, my nails painted a soft nude. As I looked in the mirror, I told myself today would be special for all of us. I imagined Joshua would find me before the ceremony, pull me into a hug, say something like, "We couldn't have done this without you, Mom." I held on to that vision like a lifeline. But when I arrived at the venue, that image shattered almost instantly. There was no place card with my name, no seat near the front, no mention of me in the printed program, where every other family member had been so thoughtfully included. I found a young woman from the staff, hoping maybe there had been a mistake. She pointed me toward a table near the hallway, just outside the main reception room, next to the restrooms and a utility closet, a folding chair and a paper napkin. That was my place. For a moment, I couldn't move. I stood there, holding my clutch with both hands, trying not to let the sting behind my eyes show. The scent of garlic and steam from the kitchen filled the air. I could hear laughter through the doors. A muffled cheer, glasses clinking. I was sweating beneath my dress, but my arms were cold. No one came to greet me, not even Joshua. I glimpsed him once, adjusting his tie, smiling wide for photos with Lauren and her parents. They looked radiant, like a family, like I didn't exist. I sat down, legs trembling slightly, and stared at the chipped floor beneath me. My shoes stuck a little when I moved them. I folded my hands in my lap and smiled faintly every time someone passed, pretending I belonged exactly where I was. I told myself not to ruin it, not to cause a scene. It was his day, after all. Wasn't that what good mothers do? The ceremony began. I watched it through the swing of the doors, catching glimpses between the comings and goings of servers. I saw the kiss. I saw the applause. I saw them take their first steps into married life, hand in hand, with no glance in my direction. Inside me, something loosened, quietly, imperceptibly, like a crack running through the foundation of a house. I didn't cry. I didn't leave. I just sat there, watching, my heart quietly rearranging itself around the truth. Maybe my place in Joshua's life had already changed. Maybe this wasn't an oversight. Maybe it was a message, and I had heard it, loud and clear. The apartment greeted me with silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settled over everything like a heavy dust, thick and unmoving. The wedding was over. The photos would be printed, the gifts opened, the stories shared over brunches and glasses of wine. But I had returned to a rented one-bedroom filled with secondhand furniture and the lingering scent of hairspray and disappointment. There was no note from Joshua, no message saying thank you, not even a simple text. They had flown off to Hawaii the morning after the wedding. The honeymoon had been a surprise from Lauren's parents, another grand gesture from people who always knew how to do things loudly, beautifully, publicly. I wasn't jealous, not really, just absent, like I had been airbrushed out of the final frame. I kept checking the mailbox for a week. Maybe they'd send a postcard, maybe something small with my name on it. But nothing came, just utility bills and grocery flyers, so I stopped checking. A few weeks later, Joshua texted. They wanted to have me over for dinner. Their new house, he said, a house Lauren's parents had given them, a wedding gift, a 4-bedroom colonial on a quiet street with a picket fence and perfect flower beds. She had moved in immediately. He followed. I wasn't asked to help with packing or moving. I found out through Facebook. Still, I said yes. I told myself it would be good to see him, to feel part of something again. I brought a bottle of wine. It wasn't expensive, but I picked it carefully. I wore a navy blouse and slacks, something neat, not too much makeup. I didn't want to seem like I was trying too hard. I stood on their porch for a long moment before ringing the bell, hoping this was a start of something better. Lauren opened the door. She gave me a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes and turned away before I could even greet her. The dog barked from somewhere inside. Joshua appeared behind her, phone in hand, barely glancing up before walking into the living room. The house was perfect, sterile, magazine-like, framed engagement photos everywhere, not one of Joshua's childhood, no signs of where he'd come from. Dinner was already on the table, salad from a bag, pasta from a jar. They didn't let me help set it. We ate with the TV on low in the background. The conversation was clipped, surface level. Joshua barely looked up from his phone. Lauren talked about her new wellness blog, the renovations they were planning for the guest room, her friend's upcoming baby shower. I offered to help clean up, maybe cook something next time, or take care of their dog when they traveled. Lauren gave a tight smile and said they'd let me know. Joshua said nothing. I folded my napkin slowly and felt the weight of every quiet second stretch between us. After dinner, I went to the powder room, and as I returned, I heard voices from the kitchen. Lauren was on the phone, speaker on. She laughed, sharp and unkind, saying something about how they had to keep the old lady happy, how free help was still help. My name wasn't spoken, but it didn't have to be. Then she said it. She's basically our unpaid maid. What else is she gonna do? And Joshua's voice followed, not with protest or correction, just a low chuckle and the scrape of a fork against a plate. I turned around, heart thudding. I didn't confront them. I didn't slam a door. I just picked up my bag, said a soft goodbye they barely acknowledged, and walked out into the cool evening air. The street was quiet. The sky above Fort Collins was bruised with the last hints of twilight. I stood under a street lamp, the glow painting everything in a dull yellow haze. My breath misted slightly as the temperature dropped, and I pulled my coat tighter. But the chill wasn't only in the air. It was inside me, too. As I walked back to the car, the memories came rushing in, ones I hadn't thought about in years. Joshua as a baby, curled against my chest with his tiny hand tangled in my shirt, the way he used to hum when he was falling asleep. His first steps, unsteady but bold, toward a tower of plastic blocks in our old living room. The time he came home in tears because a classmate said his lunch smelled weird, and I promised I'd never pack tuna again. How he used to wake me up at 6 in the morning on Saturdays, asking if we could bake pancakes with extra blueberries. He always wanted more blueberries. I remembered sewing patches on the knees of his jeans when money was tight, staying up all night during flu season just to check his fever, saving every spare dollar to get him that telescope for his 11th birthday because he said he wanted to see Saturn. He cried when he found it in the living room, said it was the best gift he'd ever gotten. Back then, I was everything: a compass, a roof, a place to land. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Standing beneath the hum of the streetlight, I realized how far away those days were now, and how long I'd been pretending that what we had then still existed, as if love and effort were enough to hold on to a place in someone's life forever. The hollow in my chest wasn't just grief. It was the absence of being needed, the silence of all the moments I had built and held and nurtured, now forgotten. I sat in my car with the engine off and my hands in my lap, not ready to go home, but with nowhere else to go. And in that moment, I understood something painful and sharp and absolutely true. I had spent a lifetime making sure my son would never feel the cold, and somehow I'd ended up standing outside in it, alone. It was the end of October when I came home and found the notice taped to my door. A crisp white envelope, official lettering in bold across the top, fluttering slightly in the breeze like it hadn't just rewritten the next chapter of my life. The building had been sold, the letter said. The new owner had plans. I had 30 days to leave. I stood there for a long time, the keys still in my hand, the door unopened. I had nowhere to go. The apartment wasn't much, but it had been mine. It had held my quiet, my grieving, my slow rebuilding. It had held the echo of a life I was still trying to convince myself had purpose. Inside, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the letter again. The wording was cold, detached. It didn't care that I was 57, alone, or that I had poured my entire savings into someone else's happiness. I picked up the phone and called Joshua. It rang twice, then went to voicemail. I tried again. On the third attempt, he answered. He was polite, distant. He said they couldn't host anyone right now. Lauren was going through something. The energy at home was sensitive. He hoped I understood. I didn't answer. I simply hung up, staring at the call log like it might rearrange itself into something warmer. But it didn't. That night, I packed a small suitcase, just the essentials. I couldn't bear to fold everything neatly like I was going on vacation, so I didn't. I stuffed a few clothes, my toothbrush, a photo of Joshua from when he was 5, and left the rest. I booked a room at a roadside motel just outside of town. Cheap, clean enough, with a single bed and a lamp that flickered when the heater kicked on. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the patterned carpet, my suitcase resting like a dog at my feet. The silence didn't hum like it used to. Now it scraped against my ears. Sleep came only because I was too tired to fight it. My body gave in long before my mind did. And when I woke the next morning to pale sunlight filtering through plastic curtains, I felt smaller than I'd ever been. I was a guest in my own story, uninvited and misplaced. The days blurred. I went through the motions of survival, eating when I remembered, walking the halls of the motel to feel something under my feet, staring at the ceiling long after midnight. No one called, no one checked in, not even Joshua. One afternoon, I opened the small box I had kept since my husband's death, a mix of things I couldn't part with: his watch, a birthday card, a stack of old family letters. I had meant to sort through them months ago, but never had the heart. That day, I did. Tucked between yellowing envelopes was one I hadn't remembered seeing before. My aunt's handwriting, precise, strong, the way she'd always signed her name. She'd been a lawyer in Denver, a sharp mind, sharper tongue. She had died quietly, without fanfare, and I had only gone to the service out of duty. She'd never had children, and we hadn't been close. Inside the envelope were several legal documents, clearly official, stamped and notarized. A letter addressed to me, and beneath it, a set of keys taped to the inside of a folder. I read the letter once, then again. It seemed that Aunt Ruth had left me something, a property in Denver. Not just a house, but a duplex in a historic district, half of which had long been rented out, the other left empty for reasons unknown. She had tried to contact me years ago, the letter explained, but assumed I wasn't interested after no response. I had changed addresses so many times back then, it didn't surprise me I had missed it. I sat motionless with the letter in my lap and the hum of the motel heater groaning behind me. I didn't know what to feel: relief, guilt, disbelief. It didn't matter. It was real, a home, a place, something of my own. The next morning, I drove to Denver. The city stretched around me like a memory I couldn't quite place. Tall buildings, cool air, golden leaves spinning in the streets. I found the address on a quiet street of brick townhouses and aging maples. The building was old but sturdy. Ivy curled along the fence, and the porch creaked when I stepped on it. The law office listed in the letter was still in business. I walked in with the papers clutched tightly in my hand, half expecting someone to laugh, to tell me there'd been a mistake, but they didn't. The receptionist offered me water. The attorney, her name was Melissa, explained that the title was clean. Taxes paid. Tenants steady. The apartment upstairs could be moved into immediately if I wanted. I walked out with keys in my hand, a copy of the deed in my purse, and a life I hadn't known was waiting for me. I sat on the steps outside and stared at the sidewalk. A breeze rustled the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. I didn't smile, not yet, but I closed my eyes and let the air touch my face. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. I decided to stay in Denver. At first, it was a matter of survival. I had nowhere else to go. But something about the old building on West Ellsworth Avenue stirred something inside me I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just that the property was mine. It was that, for the first time in a long time, I had a place that didn't ask me to leave. The building was tired, cracked window panes, warped floorboards that moaned under every step, radiators that sputtered more than they warmed. But it had character, history. It felt like it had been waiting for someone to remember it still had worth. I moved into the top floor apartment, the one with the sloping ceiling and the little wrought iron balcony. Sunlight spilled through the grimy windows in long golden stripes, softening the harshness of the worn interior. That first night, I slept on a bare mattress surrounded by boxes. The room was cold and the silence was thick, but I felt oddly at peace. No voices to shrink for, no eyes to impress. Just me and a place of my own. In the weeks that followed, I threw myself into the work. I didn't rush. I paced myself. The building was old, and I didn't want to strip away its soul. I hired Carl, a local property manager with white hair and hands calloused from real labor. He reminded me of my late husband, steady, measured, kind without trying to be. Carl knew the city and its people, tradesmen who still charge by the hour, not by the mood, electricians who took their time, painters who covered every inch without leaving splatter. We started with the bones, plumbing, heat, wiring. Then came the rest. We cleaned stairwells by hand, replaced the stained carpeting with polished laminate, repainted the doors in soft earth tones. I chose the fixtures myself, brushed bronze handles, warm light bulbs, curtain rods made of oak. I didn't want luxury, I wanted dignity. I kept the rent fair well below the average and asked for nothing more than a name, a reference, and a handshake. The apartments filled fast. Teachers, single parents, young people with big dreams and small wallets, retirees who spoke softly and smiled when they passed me in the hallway. I stayed anonymous. Carl handled the leases, the bills, the maintenance. I was just the woman upstairs with lavender pots on the railing and a gray cat who liked to nap in the windowsill. I didn't need them to know my name. I just needed to feel useful again. I watered the tiny patch of lawn out back. I cleared snow from the sidewalk when the forecast failed. On holidays, I baked cookies and left them in the entryway wrapped in napkins. I had been invisible for so long. Now, I chose to be. One foggy afternoon in early February, Carl knocked with a file in his hand. A new rental. A couple had signed through a third-party agency. No red flags. He just needed a quick approval. I glanced at the names. Adam and Rachel White. Nothing unusual, but the signature caught my eye. The loop of the R, the careful spacing. Too neat, too deliberate. I leaned in, a grainy ID photo, sunglasses, a scarf. I stared. Lauren. I felt no heat in my face. My stomach didn't turn. I read the paperwork twice, then handed it back. Carl nodded and left. I sat in the kitchen as the sunlight faded, holding a lukewarm cup of tea and thinking how strange life could be. They moved into 2B, one floor down, 2 doors away. I watched them unload a moving van from behind my curtain. Lauren stepped out first, dragging a battered suitcase. Her hair was dull, twisted in a haphazard bun. Her clothes hung on her like they didn't belong. Joshua followed, arms full of boxes. His face was drawn. The charm I remembered had hardened into something tired. They didn't speak, not to each other, not to the neighbors, just silence and small grunts of effort. I didn't say anything. I didn't greet them. I didn't bake a welcome loaf or leave a card like I usually did. I stayed quiet. I observed. Days passed. I saw them come and go, rarely together. She left early. He stayed in. Arguments bled through the walls, thin as they were. Harsh words cut off by the slamming of doors, the occasional crash, the silence afterward, heavy and accusing. From my window, I saw Lauren stand by the dumpster once, staring down at something in her hand. A broken frame, maybe. Joshua emerged later, pacing the alley with a phone pressed to his ear, voice low and desperate. No more smiles, no more certainty. They didn't know who owned the building. They didn't know whose roof kept them dry, whose boiler kept their showers warm. It was poetic justice in muted colors. They had spent so long shaping an image, living for show. Now they lived on grace they didn't even know had a face. I didn't hate them. I wasn't seeking revenge. I just watched. I listened. I learned. And in the quiet, I became something new. I had spent years being erased, dulled down into a role. But now, in a crumbling building with crooked walls and a heartbeat in its bricks, I had stepped back into the frame. No longer the ghost in the room. I was the light, not to dazzle, but to see. And I saw everything. The notice went out on a Monday. It was routine, just a modest rent increase, carefully calculated to keep up with rising maintenance costs and property taxes. Every tenant received the same printed letter, slipped discreetly under their doors. I had Carl handle the distribution, as always. Nothing personal, nothing vindictive. Business. That evening, I sat by the window in my apartment, the one with the soft golden light and the scent of rosemary drifting in from the herb box. I sipped my tea and watched the courtyard below. A few tenants stopped to chat near the garden beds we'd planted in spring. One of the older women, Judy from 1C, waved up at me. I waved back. No one seemed upset. Most understood. I kept rent fair. Always had. But 2 days later, Carl forwarded me an email. The subject line was in all caps, the tone seething beneath a thin layer of civility. It was signed with Joshua's name. The message accused the management of targeting them, called the rent hike predatory and discriminatory. There was a veiled threat about contacting a lawyer and a final line that twisted like a blade, something about how some landlords forget where they came from. I read it once, then again, then shut my laptop without replying. That night, I stood in my small kitchen, running a damp cloth along the edge of the counter. I paused as my fingers brushed a chip in the laminate, one that had been there since before I moved in. I thought of Harold, my late husband, how he used to run his hand along every surface of our home before guests arrived, checking for dust or smudges as if someone else's judgment could penetrate the life we had built together. He would have laughed at that email. Not a cruel laugh. Harold didn't have it in him, but a knowing one, full of that quiet understanding he always carried. He had been the one to tell me again and again that people often lash out when they're scared, when they've built their world on someone else's back and feel it start to shift beneath them. I missed him terribly in that moment, missed the way his voice grounded me, missed the way he saw people, truly saw them, without illusion. Harold had been an attorney in Denver for nearly 30 years, the kind who kept a spare tie in his glove box and never once raised his voice in court. He believed in rules, in fairness, in showing up when it mattered most. And he would have told me not to respond, just like I hadn't. Instead, I turned my attention to what mattered. The new cafe was finally coming together. We had renovated the old storage unit on the first floor, transformed it with warm wood tables and string lights. A local baker agreed to supply fresh pastries each morning. I named it The Hearth. It felt right. It felt like a place where people could feel seen. I offered discounts to single mothers, free coffee on Sundays for seniors. One of the tenants, a retired art teacher, started a weekly watercolor circle in the back room. I joined them once, painted a crooked teacup, but mostly I just listened. They talked about old memories, favorite recipes, the aching beauty of late life. No one asked what brought me to Denver. No one knew. That was the comfort of anonymity. I was just the woman upstairs who ran things. Meanwhile, the apartment in 2B remained tense. I rarely saw Lauren anymore. When I did, her face looked drawn, like a candle burning from both ends. Joshua sometimes wandered the courtyard alone, eyes lowered, hands stuffed into the pockets of a jacket that no longer fit him right. The vibrancy he once carried was gone, replaced by something dull, brittle. Then, one afternoon in March, a knock came at my door. I knew before I opened it. He stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. There was a hollowness to him I didn't recognize, or maybe I simply hadn't seen it before. His face was thinner, older. Life had worn him down. He looked like a boy who had finally run out of excuses. I didn't invite him in. I didn't ask why he came. He spoke. I listened. There were words, apologies, explanations. Something about mistakes and being lost and not knowing how far gone things had become until they cracked open around him. He reached for me in ways I could tell he hadn't rehearsed, but none of it touched the place inside me that once would have wept to hear it. As he talked, I drifted. I saw Harold again, sitting at our old dining room table, tying his tie, smiling at me like I was the only thing in the room that mattered. I thought of the day Joshua was born, how Harold had held him so carefully, like something sacred. How, after Harold passed, I told myself I would do it all. Raise our son, build him a future, love him enough for two. I had given too much of myself away to mourn what Joshua was offering now. I let him finish. I let him search my face for softness. I gave him only silence, and when I spoke, I did so with a clarity I hadn't felt in decades. I told him I had spent a lifetime giving time, money, pieces of myself I'd never get back. I told him this wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about boundaries, about knowing when something has rotted beyond repair. I told him I was done. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the doorway, between him and the life I had finally reclaimed. He looked at me one last time, as if hoping for a crack in the armor, some hint of the woman who used to press ice packs to his knees and save the corner piece of cake just for him. She was gone. He left. I closed the door with a calm hand. Outside, the cafe sign flickered on. Laughter drifted up through the courtyard. Downstairs, the art group had started again, watercolor brushes tapping gently on paper like tiny heartbeats. The smell of cinnamon bread filled the hallway. Inside, I sat at my desk and picked up a paintbrush. A new canvas waited. No sun, no noise, no apologies, just light. It had been a month since I closed the door and chose not to open it again. The building had changed in subtle, beautiful ways. There were more planters along the walkway, filled with rosemary, thyme, and little bursts of lavender. The tenants had taken to leaving books on the bench in the courtyard for others to borrow. Someone painted a mural on the back wall, sunflowers, stars, and a quote about belonging. I didn't ask who did it. I just smiled every time I passed by. That Friday evening, we hosted a literary reading in the cafe. I had suggested it offhandedly one day during the art circle, and within a week it had become a full event. People brought poems, short stories, little memoirs scribbled in the margins of old notebooks. I printed flyers and slipped them under every door. Carl helped string up lights in the front windows. Judy donated mismatched tablecloths from her sewing days. Someone brought an old record player. We played Ella Fitzgerald while the room filled. I spent the afternoon preparing. I wore the soft blue dress I had tucked away in the back of the closet for years, waiting for an occasion that never seemed to come. I let my hair fall loose around my shoulders. I set out a spread of finger sandwiches, cut vegetables, and a cheese board I arranged like a painting. I lit candles. I clipped fresh flowers from the garden, a few snapdragons, some eucalyptus, and placed them in mason jars at the center of each table. By 7, the room was full. Neighbors, tenants, friends I hadn't known I'd made. The couple from upstairs who always left their shoes neatly by the door. The shy teenage girl from 3A who'd asked me once if she could read her poem, just in a whisper. She read it tonight. Her voice shook, but she made it to the end. Everyone clapped. Someone cried. I didn't read anything. I didn't need to. I sat among them, a plate of fruit in my lap, a glass of sparkling water in hand. I laughed. I nodded. I passed napkins. I felt the warmth of candles reflecting in eyes that looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. Later, near the end, one of the older tenants, Charles from 2D, stood up with his wine glass and cleared his throat. The room hushed. He looked around, then at me. His voice cracked a little, but it held steady. He raised a toast. "To Nancy," he said, "to the woman who reminds us that it's never too late to come home to yourself." The room filled with murmurs, with clinking glasses, with smiles that reached the soul. My chest swelled with something unfamiliar and grounding. I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel used. I felt whole. The next morning I woke early before the sun had fully reached the tops of the buildings. The world was quiet in that soft, golden way it sometimes is, just before it stretches into day. I poured myself a cup of coffee, slipped on a sweater, and stepped out onto the front porch. A cat, Ginger and Scrappy, curled up beside my feet, her tail flicking with lazy ownership. She'd been hanging around for weeks. I never chased her off. This morning, I opened the door and let her in. Across the courtyard, 2 children were chasing Bubbles. Their laughter bounced against the brick walls like wind chimes. Somewhere inside, someone was playing piano, halting notes, beginner's hands. I sat on the porch swing, the cup warm between my palms. The air smelled of grass and bread and something sweet, like peace maybe. And as I sat there, my mind drifted to what I might do next. I imagined expanding the cafe, maybe adding a little bookshelf, a lending library with notes from the readers scribbled in the margins. I thought of starting a weekly storytelling night where neighbors could share their life tales over warm cider and pie. I could organize gardening days for the courtyard, let the kids plant something with their own hands. There was even a part of me that dared to think about travel again. I remembered how much Henry and I used to dream about driving the Pacific Coast Highway, stopping at every scenic overlook, taking photos we never planned to print. He would hold my hand while I read roadside maps upside down and pretend I was navigating, even though he always knew the way. He'd laugh, kiss the back of my hand, and say, "You just like the adventure of being a little lost." I missed him more gently now. The grief was still there, but softer, like the edge of sea glass, worn down by time and tide. I spoke to him in quiet moments. I told him about the cafe, about the girl from 3A's poem, about the cat who adopted me. And I hoped he could see that I was okay, better than okay. The future no longer frightened me. It called to me softly and clearly. I wanted to teach a writing class. I wanted to host an autumn festival in the courtyard with string lights and pumpkin bread. I wanted to decorate the lobby for every holiday and give the building the kind of warmth that made people feel they belonged the moment they stepped through the door. For the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like presence. It felt like mine. This wasn't a new beginning with fireworks or fanfare. It was quieter than that. Surer, like the soft thud of a chair being pulled back at a table you finally built for yourself. And I sat at my table, in my place, right where I was always meant to be.